Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Karen Mary Davalos' La Quinceañera, Making Gender and Ethnic Identities. I really like this article. I taught it a while ago and then I stopped, and but coming back to it, I'm really refreshed by it as an article. One of the things that I like is she starts off by problematizing herself as an ethnographer. She self-identifies as a Mexicana, and that's the term that she uses. And so when we're talking about people, we're talking about identities, we refer to them by the term by which they choose to refer to themselves, or would like us to choose to refer to them as. So this is a 20-year-old article. Mexicana might have eclipsed as a term of choice in that time, but within the ethnographic now of this article, that's the term of choice, that's the term of use, so that's the term that I'll use in the video. But she locates herself in this complicated position. So she begins with a little bit of the history of the position of the anthropologist and the sort of strange role that anthropologists who also have a marked ethnicity, by which is meant an ethnicity that is different from the mainstream, that sort of classic idea of there is the assumed normal of colonial Anglo heteronormative culture, and then with the presumption that people who embody that can somehow be objective, and anyone who is of a particular culture that falls outside of that privileged, when they're doing work on activities within that same general cluster of background, they are assumed to have this kind of insider status, which is just this real awkward dialectic binary. And so she states outright that she's not, yes, there is a thick overlap between herself and the people that she has as her subjects of inquiry, the young Mexicana of the Chicago area, but she is not an absolute insider, nor is she accepted as an absolute insider. There is a problematizing that she just comes right out and says at the beginning of the article. It's quite wonderful. She's citing a lot of people to explain that positionality, and there was something about this. I mean, I think it's explicit from the article itself that this is essentially the condensation of, if not her entire dissertation, at least a significant part of her dissertation. And so it's like I'm covering the bases. So if you're reading the article and you find the first 2 pages in that sort of, when are they going to start talking about quinceañera? That is sort of the nature of this kind of article. But I think it's important, and it's one of those things where if you read it the first time, you're like, where you go back to this, and then you read it the second time, it's like, now I get it. So I think it's a great place to start. But what's she talking about? She's talking about, as the title suggests, a quinceañera, which is what do we call it? Is it a rite of passage? Is it a tradition? And these are the very questions that she's problematizing as she goes forward. But let's just call it a rite of passage, because that appears to be, if not the generic name for how to approach it, it is often invoked. At the age of 15, Mexicana women, other Latinx women communities, other Latinx communities as well have it, but this is particularly how it's manifested in the Mexicana community and the Mexicana community of Chicago, have often participate in something that signals something for the young woman. The 15-year-old woman, 15-year-old girl becomes 15-year-old woman, might be one way of suggesting it. Davalos is at great pains to not try and suggest to not provide a general description. And so often in these articles, we sort of come across a synopsis, a précis, the description of a type, really, of what is involved in a ceremony. And then any ethnographic moment that happens within the article, within the fieldwork, is measured against this assumed normative. And the assumed normative is a useful analytical tool to consider. Folklore is built, anthropology is built, linguistics for that matter is built, grammar is built, political science is built on models, on the idea that there is a kind of structure that eliminates the contingent and just describes the necessary. And then, we can celebrate the contingent, but we sort of recognize that it is draped across this. And again, it's a useful analytical tool, but then it does serve that issue of potentially diminishing any kind of implementation of it. Because one of the things that she's talking about is that quinceañera is described by two different groups. Again, they're not in strict opposition to each other. And it's not that they have two radically distinct interpretations of the quinceañera, but they have perhaps different locations and different settings of it. And she delineates the church and journalists, and she could add anthropologists and folklorists and people like us who are describing and sometimes criticizing, sometimes celebrating, but thinking of it as an individual process and trying to put it into that perspective for whatever rationale, whether it is to use this as an illustration of the rites of passage, which is kind of what I am doing, to from the church perspective, that the two different perspectives within the church, one in terms of explaining its role and then putting it into the context of the Catholic Church's mission of embracing localized ways of religiosity and sort of having a dialogue between sort of vernacular religious practice and official church practice. Conversely, there's church criticism about the quinceañera, in large part because of the issue of whether it is about sexuality, and the issue about whether it is a waste of money, whether it is something that the church should not be supporting, in large part because it could potentially have economic detriment to the celebrants. And then there's sort of the journalistic aspect, which has this sort of, and she even, Davalos even sort of pulls out these threads that sometimes it's in this kind of human interest, like, look at what this interesting community is doing, which is simultaneously celebratory of this community while also kind of fetishizing their oddness. Like, look at what this ethnic group is doing. And also in the business pages and of newspapers, where it's like, this is a thing that clearly has a economic potential. So just like the way there is an entire industry around brides and weddings, there could be a similar industry, obviously not as big, but potentially on a case-by-case basis, close to as lucrative for the quinceañera. So what is this thing? And then, if that's one camp, the church, the journalists, and the anthropologists, on the other hand, there are the camp of the celebrants themselves, people who have undergone it, people who choose to participate, whether as the initiator and says, I am about to turn 15 and I want my quinceañera, or the family who are facilitating that, and that you are about to turn 15, let us plan your quinceañera, or even the family who are of that group, Mexicana Chicagoans, but do not participate, whether through circumstance, because it is an expense, and the criticism about how it could be something that is not celebrated, that might not ought to be celebrated, does have an economic merit if whether or not one accepts that as beyond sort of the patronizing advice of these people can't afford it, and that sort of your dismissive attitude, or whether they wish to have it in a slightly different way. Because another thing that Davalos talks about, and another reason why she avoids the issue of what is a general quinceañera, is the idea that once you propose this model, it's one thing for the anthropologist, it's one thing for the journalist, it's one thing for the churchman to present this model. But once you do that, once you accept that there is a way of doing a quinceañera, then any kind of variation from it is going to be fundamentally criticized in some way. And the decisions on how it's done are complex. And whether it is because of economics, whether it is because of personal style, whether it is because of the questions that are being addressed through the rite, that's going to affect how the rite takes place. Because what does the quinceañera signify? If we're accepting this as an example of a rite of passage, and I think we kind of have to, the question is, what is the transformation? Rite of passage is a separation, transition, and an incorporation. A move from one social status in the group to a different social status in the group. And the ceremonial script that we follow that brings attention to that individual shifting in status through material culture, through play, through prayer, because this is also, the issue is that it is there's a specific mass that's involved. Through so it has a religious connotation to it. Through whatever kind of things that happen, again, without wanting to suggest a normative model. But okay, so a status has changed. Whose status? Or particularly, what is the status? What are they becoming? And that becomes one of the polyvalent meanings of the quinceañera. Clearly, it is marking a shift from childhood to adulthood. But how is adulthood being defined at this moment? Is it an adulthood because it is post, not too far post, but post-pubescent? Is it an adulthood that is defined by sexuality? And that's one of the critiques that the church and other people will sometimes put on the quinceañera, in that it is like a coming out. It is the cynical idea is that the family is basically saying, what is that? How is it actually expressed? Here's the girl, and she's ripe for the picking. That all of a sudden, this person who had been asexual because they are a child is now sexual because they are an adult. That they are now in the conversation of potential mates, as defined sexually, not defined in terms of, beginning the process of potential betrothal partners. On the other hand, so we can look again. We can look at that we can look at that cynically and say that it's this weird presentation of a young woman as now sexual. Conversely, from the perspective of the young woman, that is not necessarily inherently a negative thing. That the idea of, no, this is a presentation of self, that I am taking control over my own body. I am no longer beholden to the expectations of childhood. It does not mean that I am, quote unquote, ripe for the picking, but it means I am no longer a child. It means that one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways that I define myself is in part that I am interested. And this is the way that it is done here, the way it is discussed, is a very heteronormative approach, and she says that expressly. I don't know if she had access to young either lesbian or bi or trans Mexicanas in the 1990s, whether the still rather conservative culture of Hispanic Chicago Catholicism would have had that discussion in a public enough forum for an anthropologist to have been able to access. So the data is limited to a fairly heteronormative structure. There has been subsequent work on the quinceañera within, even though this is only the 1990s, within sort of the 21st century shift to a more complicated understanding and a more nuanced and open understanding of adolescent sexuality and the possibility of having lesbian or trans or bi identity earlier and earlier and validated by the family. Because again, this is a matter of presentation of self, but within the confines of potentially oppressive structures. So how does one present oneself? So Davalos is one of the things that she wants to tease out, is that it is not that the very thing that is being criticized as a dismissive context might actually be embraced, but not dismissed, but not in a way that is inherently sort of counter-hegemonic. There's a wonderful description on 116. Victoria, a resident of the United States who never expects to return to Mexico, explained it to me this way: niñas become jóvenes, but not mujeres. In other words, little girls become young women, but not adult women. Using the combination of Spanish and English, the point is subtle but clear. The girl comes to experience herself as a sexual being, but not as a person who engages in sexual intercourse or becomes pregnant. So it is a transition, but not in a clear binary non-sexual to radically performatively engaged sexual, but entering into this awareness of that this will be part of her future, if not necessarily her immediate now. So there's that sort of interesting possibility of how to interpret the quinceañera. The other is its very Mexican identity, that the quinceañera is as much about reaffirming, but also reinterpreting. Reaffirming one's status as, one's identity, let's not use status quite yet, but one's identity as a Mexicana, as a person with this cultural background that is being affirmed and reaffirmed and celebrated. Because you have a community. I love the way that Davalos doesn't talk about this community as an immigrant community, because again, the immigrant community expresses some kind of strict binary. A population was in this place, origin site, and now they are in this place, present site, Chicago, and that's it. This kind of movement. Whereas This community frequently moves back and forth. They are largely based, and they all have legal standing in the United States. They are either citizens or landed immigrants with papers and all that. Nevertheless, they frequently go back. They will send their children back for vacations and holidays, in part to spend time with family, but to learn language and so on. They are acculturating in the United States. They are American by any other, by any objective measure. Nevertheless, they also retain and celebrate and keep this form of identity. And so the quinceañera is one of those opportunities to express cultural affiliation, when it's not necessarily in danger of being lost, but it is, there is the issue of it sort of occasionally chipping away. So it is a thing. One of the things that Davalos doesn't talk about, which I think it's implicit, so I don't think it's like this matter of omission, but we don't necessarily always pay too much attention to the idea that things like celebrations of any kind of celebration, things like parties, things like the sort of spectacle that can be a quinceañera or any rite, is fun. That there is a joyousness, that there is a delight that comes from it, that it is, and you don't have to explain that away. You do not have to always be providing some kind of functional rationale for participating in, well, fundamentally in anything. But if we remember, and we remember this through all rites and all customs, that they might have a narrative behind them. They might have a narrative of justification behind them. And that's a good thing, and that's something to explore. And you might be able to, the analyst might be able to identify some kind of functional purpose behind them. And that's a good thing, and that's something that we should explore. But when we think about why we participate, why I participate, why you participate, why the Mexicanas participate in any rite, the idea that it brings pleasure, it brings delight, it brings a sense of community, it's a special day, it's fun, it plays with these social things in a safe way. It plays with categories like sexual and non-sexual. It plays with categories like American and Mexican. It plays with categories like a child and adult. It plays with categories like male and female. It plays with this. There is a suspension of the everyday that is fun to participate in. And we don't really have a language that takes the concept of joy seriously. And so there is something seemingly joyful in everyone who chose to participate. There is something kind of joyful in it. And in those who chose not to participate, there's the idea that I don't think it would be fun, because it's not a requirement. It is not a it is not something that needs to be done. It is something that can be chosen to be done, which is one of the reasons, of course, why why the church can be split on it. It's like, no, this is something that they choose to do, and we should facilitate it. Or conversely, no, this is something that doesn't need to be done, so we shouldn't have to participate in it because of A, B, and C. But joyfulness is an issue. She also delves into a couple of issues in terms of the notion of tradition. And here's where she could have cited a couple of more folklorists, because she was interested in this this very same thing about when you ask the question, tradition is often mired in the past. It's mired in the past because we tend to imagine that there is some kind of ancient origins. And her discussion of the proposed ancient origins, that this was an indicator that this basically had, it has indigenous roots, pre-contact roots, and then it became syncretic with Catholicism, but it is it is basically a Mexican First Nations celebration that has been brought forward, in a way, despite or half despite the colonial influence of the Catholic Church, and then also facilitated or brought in to the colonial presence of the Catholic Church, and therefore it's something that is a survival. And that's cool. I mean, it's conjecture, and it's always going to be in part conjecture. But once you start establishing it that way, first, you again give it that level of gravitas that seems to kind of undermine the issue of joy. And secondly, you start to try and essentialize it into what is actually necessary. How should this be done properly? What is the traditional quinceañera, where you start thinking older forms? And Davalos talks about this sort of, I guess, vernacular understanding of tradition, in that the influences of what goes into a quinceañera, the grammar, the vocabulary of signs and symbols that is anticipated within the quinceañeras as described and as performed by the young Mexicanas of her research project, is as much based on it's far more based on the quinceañeras of the community, of the immediate group, of cousins. It's like, oh, they had this. I want something like this, but I want it like that. And the idea that traditions are actually ongoing creative processes that are as much about the small ecotypes, the small regional variations, as they are about some kind of universal standard, is an important thing to grasp, because we can then extrapolate that onto any rite of passage as it occurs anywhere. And so, like, what comprises an Atlantic Canadian wedding, what comprises versus what comprises a Florida wedding, or what comprises a Chicago Mexicana wedding, we're going to see similarities, but we're also going to see differences. And that when you plan a wedding, or when you have a wedding planned for you, the what was good, what is the thing that I'm going to be bringing forward, is certainly, it's going to be influenced by popular culture, and it's going to be influenced by the marketplace that suggests what the dream wedding is, and we can't disassociate ourselves from that entirely. But it's also going to be like, well, remember Brenda's, that was awesome, let's do that, or let's do something like that, with the same idea of wanting to personalize it, of making it idiosyncratic, in healthy competition, perhaps in unhealthy competition, but making it your own, making it a memorable event. But what makes it a memorable event is that you are meeting the expectations of your specific audience, and then exceeding them, or the expectations are slots that are filled with things that are going to be surprises, and then the surprise is one that is proven delightful. There's this great section where she talks about asking the question, what goes in to a quinceañera, and how she's completely, totally dissed by the people she asks, in terms of sort of the patronizing smile. When I asked, and this is on 118, when I asked women to describe the most traditional way to celebrate a quinceañera, They usually smile tolerantly but disappointedly. I'm going to skip through the entire page. First, the facial expression can be understood as mutual positioning between researcher and participant. So I was known to be I was known to people as the Mexican whose research on Mexican culture made me both an expert and a novice. Among women who attributed me with expertise, my questions about the quinceañera may have been perceived as a challenge to their own status, or they may have simply wished to defer to another person. Second, because the question was all too familiar. Because clergy who refuse to celebrate the quinceañera justify their actions by claiming that people do not know the most traditional way. Third, are uncomfortable with a scale of more or less traditional, because sometimes the way it is done is an indicator of status. If you cannot afford a quinceañera, or if you cannot afford a particularly lavish quinceañera, are you somehow failing to do it properly according to some established model? And fourth, most will just push back on that idea of that there is one way, that they have a grasp of that they do not require the analytic constructs, they do not require the models of the anthropologist or of the journalist or of the clergy or of the marketer. They do not need to know what the dream quinceañera is. They have their own, and they are perfectly satisfied with that. So you can take this idea, the sort of 4 ways of being disappointed, when someone asks you what is the traditional way of doing it, to heart. It's a wonderful thing to extract. If you extract nothing else, and I think you should extract this. So, the quinceañera. It's a rite of passage. We can accept it as a rite of passage. It has these things that it is focused on a young woman. It is focused on a young woman as she becomes a young woman, as she self-identifies as a young woman with a particular past, with a particular family, with a particular cultural inheritance, with a particular on the precipice of a new set of questions about how to be in the world. And it is not necessarily the time when she knows the answers to those questions, but it is the time when she knows that she must begin to address those questions, that she can fundamentally no longer defer the idea. So sometimes we think of the rite of passage as these times of uncertainty because one is between statuses, that one is between the fixed status of child and adult. There's an argument to be made that the quinceañera is basically this way of entering into not adulthood, but adolescence, where you're defining adolescence as in itself its own transitional liminal field. Years of transition, years of uncertainty, years of half still being a child and half becoming an adult, where it is the time of experimentation, it is the time of extended but not unlimited liberties, it is the time of additional yet still limited responsibilities, and the definition, the invention of teenagerhood is basically a 20th century thing. And so even though the quinceañera has origins, again, which we can look at the historical trail of the quinceañera, not cynically, but just like, okay, sure, this is a thing that existed in the past. But the contemporary quinceañera is arguably an announcement that I am now entering into this long, protracted period of liminality. That it is not like a bar mitzvah, where you become an adult, because you now have those responsibilities in a temple. You are fundamentally an adult, but as an adult in terms of the religious practice. Rather, it is I'm now entering into this modern world where adolescence is inherently fraught. This is the announcement that I am prepared to enter into this. So it is a transition to a transitional time. It announces that. And so is it, if the rite of passage has this structure, the classic Van Genepian structure of separation, transition, and incorporation, and that various rites deal with various movements, like birth rites deal with incorporation, welcome into our group. Funerary rites deal with separation, goodbye, you're leaving this group. Do we actually, it's too simple, perhaps, to imagine that we all live in these categories, these social statuses that are defined largely by being static and clear at all times, because there are these elements, and I think adolescence is probably the best example of it. There are certain forms of, I think, on the edge of senescence, where one is not quite hit elder status, but one is not quite in that adult status. You might be literally, and maybe I'm just now projecting, but I think adolescence is this time that has now been created where the whole idea is that there is it's a period in flux. I think student life is another period in flux, where students are an example of, you are no longer the student of the elementary in the high school situation, but nor are you a member of the workforce. So the university student becomes another extended liminal time. And if adolescence is an extended liminal time, that is about social and sexual, as opposed to perhaps the university student, which is about sort of functional and capitalist liminality. Does the quinceañera announce they're about to, here is a transition to this period in your life where uncertainty exists? And all the questions, and even all the regrets that her informants have about the nature of the quinceañera and what it means, and so why things were chosen. It's really kind of a fascinating thing. I'm going to confess that this issue of the quinceañera being an announcement into liminality is something that is occurring to me while I am filming this. But I think there might be a point there. I think there might be something remarkably fascinating, because the redress of that is that you are about to enter into adolescence. You are about to enter, and again, 15. This is sort of social adolescence, as it were. These questions might already have been circulating, where you are, the expectation of, the possibility of sexuality, the possibility of what you're going to do for a living starts to become the real issue. How are you going to continue your education? Do you can start contributing to the household in a more directly economic way? What are your new responsibilities? All those things that you experience through adolescence, where it's like, things are going to change now. And it's not simply the person announcing. The family is saying, all right, we know that this is now going to be a fairly shitty time for you. This is the time for questioning. Let's begin this process. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's something there. It's because it's messy that makes it complicated. Again, the Van Genepian system and so many of our systems imply systematization, imply that the status is kind of set and understood, and that once you hit adulthood, you kind of know what's going on, and in your child, you kind of know what's going on. And all these social statuses are defined and also easy to inhabit. And so the rites become fairly simple to explain by you were this, you will be this, and in between, transition. But when the you will be this is so fraught, do we still have that period of transition? I'm definitely blathering, but I'm definitely onto something. Because, final point, I swear, final point, go back to our basic principles, that the rite of passage is about the individual moving through these statuses, but it is about the group reaffirming its sense of groupness, despite the fact that its constituent members are in transition, and that its constituent members will eventually transition out entirely and move through. And so what does it say, not simply to the celebrants, but to the group that defines itself in part by, here we go, a group that defines itself in part by being a group that has this rite that is found to be meaningful? Is it important because it is an important aspect that the group defines itself in large part by having an ambiguous status for a long time? Is this something that is different? And she suggests that it is, but she doesn't go into much detail. Is it something that is expressly different in a community that already has roots, but complex transitional roots, because it doesn't define itself entirely by it being now in America? It doesn't define itself by being now English speaking. It doesn't define itself by being one specific thing. It defines itself by having a complex identity, and the complexity of the identity is at its fore just in the period prior to becoming an adult, where those things now have to more or less be set in stone. And you just have this strange period of liberty in adolescence where everyone has that sort of that last thing of like, all right, what does it mean to be me? Yeah. You know what they need? They need a quinceañera for midlife crises. But maybe that's just me. Okay. This is fun. Sorry. This will make sense. I'll see if I can edit it into something that makes sense. But it's a great article. And I highly recommend. It has lots of cross-references, lots of, what Ronaldo says. It's like, that's all good. As you're reading it, there's times when you can like, I might skip this paragraph. But I heartily recommend that when you do that, get to the meat of the article, and then read it again, and all of a sudden, those things that you skipped over are of utmost importance. Yeah. So my friends, I'm going to stop now. My name is Ian, and I have been talking you through La Quinceañera, Making Gender and Ethnic Identities by Karen Mary Davalos. As ever, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.